Tonight, we're going to discuss policing, the NYPD, the Ferguson effect nationally. Speakers will be Heather McDonald. Heather testified. Heather's writings are so well known and so important that she testified before Congress yesterday. And if anyone is interested, her testimony is available online at the Manhattan Institute website. Heather is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and her writings on policing, as I say, policing have been enormously influential. The other speaker will be Harry Siegel, who is a relative. He's my oldest son, but because of that, I will not be the moderator. I will be sitting down up in front. Harry writes for the New York Daily News. He writes a regular column, and if you get a chance, read his column tomorrow morning. It's every Thursday that he has a column. And often he writes about police and policing issues. The moderator will be Kay Hymowitz, also of the Manhattan Institute. Kay is distinguished for excellent writing about families and children, tweens. I recommend her book, Manning Up, about the great deficit of adulthood among young American males. With that, let me invite Kay to come up for a second, and we'll get started.
Good evening and welcome to what promises to be a most interesting discussion of a most consequential topic. Consequential just to not just New York City politics, but to its citizens and its future prospects. As all of you probably know, New York City experienced a stunning drop in crime since the early 1990s. It's a decline that impacted neighborhoods across the city, black and white, rich and poor. It revived business, it brought back tourists, it vastly improved street life, and it saved many, many lives. My own children who grew up in Brooklyn, when they went to overnight camp in the 80s, the first thing that their bunkmates would say when they heard they were from Brooklyn was, "Brooklyn, have you ever been shot?" Fast forward into the 90s when they went to college, and they would come home and shrug their shoulders and say, "Why does everybody want to move to Brooklyn?" So that reflects the changes. For quite a long time, I think the improved safety made many New Yorkers, and particularly those who had lived through the bad old days, fairly friendly towards New York City's finest and forgiving. There were incidents that were raised some questions about some of their procedures. I'm thinking particularly of the 41 shots that were fired at Amadou Diallo and killed him, that's in 1999. But these controversies tended to pass, I wouldn't say quickly, but without too much impact over the long run. That grace period that the New York public had seems to have had, it looks like it's over. There is increasing call for looking more closely at police practices, increasing number of objections to stop and frisk, to the disproportionate summons and arrests of minority men in particular. The death of Eric Gardner in Staten Island a year ago last summer, and the aggressive tackling of tennis star James Blake in front of a Midtown hotel. If you add to that some of the events around the country, the Michael Brown death, Tamir Rice, the boy who had a fake gun and was shot by the police in Ohio, and Freddie Gray, of course, in Baltimore. And you have a growing sense that perhaps some of the excessive force that people have sometimes complained about is more pervasive than we realized. One of those people who has been growing impatient with the New York City Police Department is Harry Siegel. Harry has been chronicling some of what he views as the excesses of today's policing in his column in the Daily News. Now, to his credit, Harry admits that he has a personal interest in the subject. He was, in fact, he forgot to pay a ticket for riding his bike on the sidewalk, and in fact found himself subject to an arrest warrant. Fortunately, he's the son of a prominent Brooklyn family, and he got off fairly easy. So a life in crime, though, is not Harry's only credential. He has been a student of New York City politics and policy as editor at the New York Sun, Politico, New York Press, and now a columnist at the Daily News. Heather McDonald, my colleague at Manhattan Institute, takes a very different view of the NYPD, which she will, I'm sure, describe compellingly. She has written extensively about crime and policing, not just in New York, but around the country, as Fred already told you. She testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee on Monday. She has no record that I'm aware of. The format for tonight will be the following. Heather will go first. We didn't even get a chance to talk about this, but Heather has to go first, and since she was here, I said yes. She will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. Then Harry will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. We'll then have about a 10-minute period where they go back and forth, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. And we'll finish at 8. So, Heather, great.
And I'm honored to be at St. Francis, which is such a wonderful debate tradition, and I thank everybody for coming out, and we will try and finish so you can get to your TVs and watch the game tonight. Today we're mourning and trying to process another killing of a New York police officer, Officer Randolph Holder, who was shot last night while trying to apprehend a shooting suspect who had taken off on a stolen bicycle. This was in East Harlem housing projects. Officer Holder is the 4th police casualty in 11 months. All of the murderers of those 4 killed officers have been black. In 2013, the last year for which a complete analysis of police NYPD use of force is available, the NYPD killed 6 blacks. All 6 of those police victims had used or threatened to use lethal force against the officer. There's about 3,500 officers in the New York Police Department and about 1.88 million black civilians in New York City.
35,000.
So that means that an officer's chances of getting killed by a black civilian in New York is 37 times higher than the chance of a black New Yorker getting killed by a New York police officer. And yet for the last 15 months, New York and the nation has been convulsed by a protest movement known as Black Lives Matter. There's been no counterpart Blue Lives Matter movement. No New Yorker today is nervously checking his smartphone for news of outbreaks of police violence or looting. Instead, the Black Lives Matter movement has disseminated the patent untruth that there is no threat greater facing young black men today than in New York City, the New York Police Department, and more generally in the nation, police departments across the country. That lie has inspired riots, die-ins, the assassination of police officers, the elimination in New York State of traditional grand jury proceedings when officers use lethal force, and a presidential task force on policing. Tonight, I'm going to propose a counter-hypothesis to the central claim behind the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm going to argue that there is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the New York Police Department. There's no government program that has done more to revive inner city communities than the proactive policing pioneered by the New York Police Department in the mid-1990s. And there are virtually no police departments more professional, self-analytical, and well-managed than the New York Police Department. It is a marker of New Yorkers' parochialism that they are utterly ignorant about how highly regarded the New York Police Department is across the world. The NYPD is a model not just for police departments, but for government agencies, period. There are few government bodies that so rigorously hold themselves accountable for results and for their own behavior. In fact, virtually all nonprofits and in many for-profit organizations are laggards regarding self-measurement and outcome accountability compared to the New York Police Department. Now, back to the Black Lives Matter theme. There are over 10,000 minority lives who've been saved since the early 1990s, thanks to the New York Police Department. And that's due to a revolution in policing that started in 1994 and came under the general rubric of the Comstat Revolution. In '94, William Bratton started his first tour as police commissioner and embraced what was then the radical idea that the police would not just respond after the fact to crime, they would actually prevent it. To do that, they started gathering crime data fanatically, initially on a weekly basis, eventually on a daily basis, and soon on an hourly basis. Until then, the top brass at one police plaza didn't know what the crime data was until 6 months after the fact, at which point it was a little late to work on statistics. They started calling in precinct commanders on a weekly basis to be grilled downtown at one police plaza on what was happening in their commands. If those commanders didn't know every single shooting that had gone on, every single breaking robbery pattern or burglary pattern, their careers were over. These initial Comstat meetings were such high-tension affairs that chairs were thrown, and people lost their careers. Protecting the law-abiding residents became the watchword of the New York Police Department. And protecting potential crime victims meant operating most intensively in minority neighborhoods because that's where crime is highest. The most ubiquitous charge against the NYPD is that it is racist, that it's been illegitimately singling out young minority men for gratuitous police attention. The locus classicus of that racial profiling, racial disparity argument developed during the arguments and debates over the stop, question, and frisk practice. Now, the pseudo-reasoning behind that charge lives on today in the current campaign against broken windows policing, which is also said to illegitimately bear down on minority neighborhoods. The central fallacy of all such racial profiling arguments in New York, across the country, whether they're talking about pedestrian stops, whether they're talking about car stops, whether they're talking about misdemeanor quality of life enforcement, is to use a population benchmark as the measuring point for police behavior. Let's see how this works. And I'll use the stop, question, and frisk paradigm for explaining this. What we heard ad nauseum was that New York's pedestrian stops were racially biased because in the universe of all stops, the police made about 55%, 53%, 55% of all stops made by the New York Police Department had black subjects. Blacks make up about 23% of the New York population. Therefore, ipso facto, because stops were disproportionate to New York's black population, the New York Police Department must be illegitimately singling out blacks for unjustified stops. What was never pointed out in this analysis by the New York Civil Liberties Union, by the Center for Constitutional Rights, by Paul Weiss, by the advocacy groups that sued the NYPD in a trilogy of stop, question, frisk lawsuits, was that though blacks are 23% of the New York's population, they commit, average by year, about 78% of all shootings in New York City. Add Hispanic shootings to black shootings and you account for 98% of all shootings. Blacks are 23% of the population. They commit 70% of all robberies and 66% of all violent crime. Whites, by contrast, are about 34-35% of New York's population. They commit less than 2% of all shootings, about 5% of all violent crime, thanks to domestic violence, homicides, and about 4% of all robberies. The New York Times was particularly exercised about the 73rd Precinct. They had a running series on the 73rd Precinct, and Judge Shira Shandlin, in her opinion, ludicrously adopting this fallacious methodology, also talked about the 73rd Precinct stop rates. 73rd Precinct is in Brownsville. The per capita shooting rate in Brownsville is 81 times higher than in Bay Ridge, a few miles away. Brownsville is predominantly black, Bay Ridge is predominantly white and Asian. Now, every time there's a shooting, the police are going to be out in force looking to make stops to try and prevent a retaliatory shooting. That per capita shooting rate means that the residents of Brownsville are 81 times more likely to be shot than the residents of Bay Ridge. That is a tale of two cities. And it is to protect the residents of Brownsville that the police make higher stops. Their stop rate is 15 times higher than in Bay Ridge, much lower than what you would expect. And in fact, overall, the New York Police Department stops are lower of blacks than you would expect compared to their violent crime rates. The stop rates of whites are higher than you would expect. About 9% of police stops are of whites, compared again to their shooting rate, which is about 2% of all shootings, and violent crime, which is about 5% of all shootings. Now, in other words, the police cannot deploy and engage in tactics where crime is highest without generating racially disparate statistics. What is the other thing that determines police strategy? Community demands for assistance. You cannot go to a police community meeting in the 23rd Precinct in East Harlem, or the 33rd Precinct in Harlem, or the 40th Precinct in the South Bronx, and not hear requests like the following. I want the dealers off the corner, you arrest them and they're back the next day. There's kids hanging out on my stoop, why can't you arrest them for loitering? The police have to explain that the Supreme Court stripped them of that power several decades ago. I met a cancer amputee named Mrs. Sweeper in the Mount Hope section of the Central Bronx several years ago, an elderly lady. The only time she felt safe to go get her mail in her building, which is a private building, was when the police were there. She said, "Please, Jesus, send more police." She recalls fondly the summer that there was a police watchtower on the corner. That was the safest summer they ever had. The only time she felt safe, that was to try and stop the shootings. In June, I went to a police community meeting in the 41st Precinct in the South Bronx. They were begging for one of these watchtowers, the very symbol to the Bernard Harcourts of the world of the police panopticon. A man said, every time I hear a shooting, I run towards it because I'm so terrified that my children have been shot.
Heather, who's Bernard? Explain who Bernard Harcourt is.
Oh, Bernard Harcourt is now a Columbia law professor. He started out at Chicago. He is a fiendish opponent of broken windows policing, believes that it is a oppression of poor minorities. Now, the shooting last night was in East Harlem. The housing projects, I've spent time there, the Johnson projects, Taft houses, Wagner houses. Again, a police committee meeting the 25th I went to. People there were complaining about huge crowds of kids hanging out on the corners. They said hundreds of kids there fighting. The girls, they said in particular, are particularly vicious. Why can't you do something about this? Why don't you have helicopters overhead? This is what the police hear every single day. The liberal elites in the New York Times have no idea what's going on in these neighborhoods as a result of family breakdown. If there were drive-by shootings where the New York Times editors live, or in Battery Park, or on the Upper East Side, there would be an enormous cry for stop, question, and frisk. People would not tolerate it. The police are the only thing that exists in these neighborhoods to control disorder. But the NYPD's restraint in the use of force is unparalleled. In 2013, the officers used their firearms for a grand total of 40 incidents. This in a department that has 20 million civilian contacts a year, that makes about 400,000 arrests and more summons, and in a city whose daytime population approaches 10 million. Force, including simply putting the hands on a suspect, is used in about 2% of arrests, almost always as a response to suspect resistance. Now I'm going to conclude and address what Fred referred to as the Ferguson effect, which I think is happening here and elsewhere in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Law and order is breaking down further in inner city neighborhoods. The situation, environment in which officers are operating is increasingly hostile, increasingly tense. This builds on problems that officers have always faced. There's a long-standing tradition in New York of airmail. This refers to trash and other objects that are thrown off of officers from housing project roofs. There's also a tradition of people blocking arrests of when officers are chasing suspects, people trying to gather around and let the suspect get off. These are things that officers experience that, again, is never part of the public discourse. But things have gotten worse since the Black Lives Matter movement spread the idea that that the police are a lethal threat to blacks. I spoke to an emergency services captain who operates mostly in the Bronx, and he told me of seeing a boy with a cart trying to manipulate it off the curb, and the cart spilled. So the officer parked his car in the street to prevent traffic and got out to help the boy, who turned out to be a special needs boy. And immediately a crowd gathered. They all whipped out the cell phones, thinking that they were going to try and get something bad that was going to be happening. And it was the tension was unbelievably high. Finally, people figured out that this was okay. When he had another incident where there was a car crash and a car had overturned, pinning a woman under it. And he was trying to get the car off. And somebody came into the accident scene, crossed the police tape, and was sticking the cell phone in the face, which is what happens to officers now across the country. And he said, please get back on the curb. And the guy said, no, well, you can't make me do that. Finally, he did get back on. But the tension now is unbelievable. And as a result, many officers are just saying, I'm not making that proactive stop. I'm not going to get out of my car. I'm certainly answering the 911 calls. But when it comes to the type of discretionary proactive policing that was the key to the New York crime drop, officers saying it's not worth it. I don't want to be the latest racist cop of the week on CNN and MSNBC. Criminal summons are down about 20% in New York. Arrests have also dropped. Shootings and murders were spiking, so much so that Bratton and de Blasio were freaking out. They started their intense, high-intensity body count program called Summer All Out a month earlier this year, and they've extended it another month. Taking every body they can out of desk jobs and putting it on the street, and using sheer police presence to try and quell what was becoming a very worrisome outbreak of violence. That has put a stop on the spike in shootings and homicides. And I'm sure Bratton is counting on cold weather to help now, but I don't know what's going to happen when he moves the police officers out of the Summer All Out program. And it has, of course, cost taxpayers millions and millions in overtime. So in conclusion, I would, of course, agree that the police need constant training in courtesy and respect. In New York, officers can be a total pain in the neck, as Harry has experienced. They're often rude, peremptory, and let's be honest, a lot of that attitude comes from the situation they get in the streets, which is out of public awareness. But that's no excuse. Just because you are constantly under criticism and hostility is no excuse for not treating everybody professionally and respectfully. And obviously, every unjustified police killing of an unarmed civilian is a stomach-churning horror. But the police and the New York Police Department work constantly to lower the use of force, and they have succeeded in doing so. And it's also the case in this country that policing has a horrible complicity in the nation's long hypocrisy when it comes to blacks and civil rights. The police were essential for slavery, they were essential for de jure segregation. And that history has a long after effect, and it's hard to forget it. I would argue, however, that we have moved far beyond it. Not only is the New York Police Department not racist and not a department that is out of control, but in the absence of fathers in the inner city who can raise their boys to be self-controlled and law-abiding, the NYPD is the best hope for people like Mrs. Sweeper to be able to lead lives free from fear and with the freedom of movement that all of us take for granted. Thank you very much.
There's a lot to cover there. I'm going to try to touch on a few things and then we'll have a conversation. All right, this is literally the most interesting and sad possible day to be having this conversation. Officer Randolph Holder, who was shot and killed in East Harlem last night, not that late, not at a scary time, at about 9:30, was the fourth cop, as Heather mentioned. And going back one second, thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to the panel, thanks to my dad. Fourth cop killed in the less than 11 months. From 2000, shot and killed. From 2000 to 2009, 10 cops were shot and killed in New York. that might be statistical noise. It's certainly isn't to these officers and their families. It's distressing, and it's one of several worrisome signs. But positing, which I'm not going to, I'll return to that, a great deal of what Heather just went through. Here's what we're looking at right now this year. So in 2015, 4 years after the peak of stop and frisk, we have 25% less shootings than we did in 2011. Murders down about 20%, shooting incidents about 23%. And this is happening with Black Lives Matter, with lots more video cameras, with all of these changes happening. We're up slightly in a couple of the violent categories, including shootings, from last year and from 2 years ago, which was a record low, but not substantially. So positing that a great many stops, a number of very aggressive policing policies that were applied, in large part because that's where the crime was in black communities and farther out, were having some impact. Frankly, I'm on the editorial board of the Daily News. We fought very aggressively against these changes. Personally, the decision that this Judge Shirshana made very little sense and was on pace to be overturned by a panel of judges when de Blasio dropped it, which was a very interesting decision. He'd run as a police reformer, but he was going to be mayor. He was going to bring in Bill Bratton. He had every ability to deal with this on his own. Instead, he accepted a level of oversight, outside oversight, that wasn't necessary, which was a interesting and strange political decision. Allowed him to declare, I've ended stop and frisk. When in fact, Ray Kelly, who'd pushed very hard for it, very aggressively, had done so about 2 years earlier. And had quietly, without announcing and giving up on this, taken the air out of that balloon fast. Most of the drop in stops comes from Ray Kelly. It's the same guy who pushed them up. So here we are. This is happening. We've had our 4th officer shot, and this happens almost literally at the same moment that the New York Times is putting out a story about a new group of law enforcement officials who want less incarceration and police reform. And this group includes Bill Bratton, who is now in an extremely complicated situation. Because it turns out that the shooter, this isn't a newspaper, so I'm not going to bother with the alleged shooter, who was himself shot, had a ridiculously long rap sheet, was a member of a drug dealing crew up there. Cy Vance, the Manhattan DA, wanted him serving a sentence, and a judge decided to put him in a drug diversion program instead. So this is exactly the sort of reform lots of people are talking about, and here's a poster child for the ways in which that can go wrong. This stuff is actually very tricky. I think Heather, who I broadly disagree with and have read over many years, is pretty wonderful at calling bull a lot of arguments from the other side. But there's things I think she misses that are very significant. I'm going to come back to Black Lives Matters in a minute, but you reach this to me, significant, obvious question, like if this has been so wonderful for Black New York, and I'm not going to posit that 10,000 lives saved number. That's a bogus number Ray Kelly came up with by counting his years and then 10 years back. So he got all the crime drop that happened before him, and the police get credit for saving all those lives, both of which I think are incorrect. But the NYPD is doing a fairly impressive job. America has a 10-year drop in crime, and in that same stretch of time, that's sort of magical and no one's fully figured out, incarceration rates are rising. New York has a 20-year drop in crime, and it does this with putting less people in prison. The police here are remarkably disciplined in all sorts of ways that are often underappreciated. They almost never use their guns, being a strong example. But what's happening, I think in some very obvious ways, is a big part of the drop in crime that's obvious and has been underappreciated because police chiefs like to, and mayors like to take credit for it. It's my strong hand, was the internet. Suddenly you had the ability to trace statistics. Bill Bratton does this first, and in this very impressive way that creates new responsiveness. Other people pick up on this fairly quickly, and you can find hotspots and deal with them in a way that doesn't just push crime somewhere else. It's very helpful. At the same time, lots and lots of street crimes go inside, and people are able to have these transactions, various sorts, without having related criminal effects. So open-air drug dealing, which continues to be an issue in some cities and in a few parts of New York, including East Harlem right now, starts having starts becoming much less significant. All these other factors happen that allow for crime to drop everywhere without any clear policing explanation. It happens at the same time that incarceration rates keep going up. At a certain point, this generates a backlash. Police commissioners work in real secrecy, and Bratton, who I like and admire in a lot of ways, and Kelly before him, were both masters of presenting themselves as the Steve Jobs-like, or Lee Iacocca for the older generation, like agent of a change that was plainly occurring to some extent with or without them. So you get there first, you brand some of what you're doing, and it becomes the main thing. Kelly did this with stop and frisk, and again, when he deflated stop and frisk, quietly, it turns out that this wasn't having so much of an effect, which I think goes a long way to explaining why black people were not so grateful for the drop in crime. That it's very easy to be simultaneously under-policed and over-policed. And the issue is, if you have a very broad set of nets you're using, so marijuana arrests were one, and this was absolutely an attempt to get more serious criminals, not just to crack down on people for racist reasons, and that's why the numbers were all about black men. Like, no one cared if women were smoking marijuana outside, because the odds that they had guns or otherwise criminally engaged for the most part were much, much lower. So Jack Maple, who was there very early on and during the Bratton years, had this whole important distinction between the dolphins and the sharks. And what happens is, over time, for a number of reasons, that it go back in many ways to getting rid of an anti-gun unit that was really elite and actually went after the worst of the worst, which is what every police commissioner since the beginning of time has used as their sort of cliche in trying to create police-community relations. We really just want to go after the worst of the worst and leave everyone else be. That unit gets badly screwed up after the 41 shots. And there are a number of other scandals that the reason they don't
shots
become...
are part of what crime?
I'm going to come right back there. The reason these scandals don't resonate the same way is there's no political will in the city for a broader change. And what distinguishes New York from many of the other places Heather pointed to with the Ferguson effect that she's said is occurring is that we now have, and for, what month, 18 months, 20 months, it's October, since 2014, have political leaders who are responsive to the to black voters in a way that wasn't the case previously. And lots of these black voters, rather than saying, thank you for all this policing, including ones I see at churches, when I was just when I was just at a few things in East New York, who absolutely want cops in and want bad guys dealt with, feel like members of their community who are not really threats, who are not problems, are also getting sucked in. And many of the policies that the NYPD was using, while insisting correctly that this was protecting black lives, and that unlike other cities, say Chicago for a long time, the police here were going to protect the entire city, were sucking in lots and lots of people who weren't really criminals, who didn't need to be involved. I've had some experience past an outstanding warrant with the policing system in New York, and it gets difficult to navigate very quickly and very early on. In the last week, we've had the candidates for district attorney in Staten Island and Long Island in our office. They're dealing with heroin crises there in both places. There's lots of cops in Nassau and in Staten Island who live in both places. And you're looking at largely white populations. And this week, both de Blasio, somewhat sensibly, and Cuomo, idiotically, came out with policies for dealing with K2, which is synthetic marijuana, which is very cheap, which for various reasons some people are using instead of plain old-fashioned marijuana, and is, according to Bill Bratton, who's sometimes very old school and silly with these things, a super drug that gives people strength and does all this other stuff. So listening to these strict law and order types competing for law and order votes and law and order places suddenly talk about heroin as a health epidemic that needs to be dealt with because it was part of their us. And they were trying to talk to voters who had family members, and it started with pills, and then for a number of reasons, because after a few years of pain pills sort of taking over, really causing serious health and crime problems. You know, in Staten Island, someone's dying every 4 days, like a young guy. And you can read these obits, you know, died in his home, right? So everyone's talking about diversion. And these people aren't really criminals. Then with K2, Cuomo has this insane out of the 80s, you know, don't do it ad with 4 hep kids who start walking in the middle of the street and say, K2, It's real bad, man. That stuff's not cool. In the meantime, if you look at who's going to emergency rooms for this, you're looking at like middle-aged, often homeless men who have the reason that the super strength and all that, and this is a scary thing that's been around for a long time, is you're looking at people with 25 other issues. So what's happened is de Blasio ran for office, and he said, Kelly was very upset. He said, I thought all these guys were my friends, the Democratic candidates, and they all turned on me. I mean, what happened was that there was this political constituency that for a number of reasons under Bloomberg and under Giuliani before him, and that started with Giuliani because the city really was in very bad shape, had just been ignored, and you should be thankful for all this policing for a very long time. And there was built up upsetness and tension about this. De Blasio came in promising a bunch of reform. He brought Bratton back. Crime has not exploded. There were all these little signs, There's more homeless people out, and some of them on the streets, regardless of what de Blasio says, and some of them are in fact mentally disturbed. And if the police aren't just going to move them on, forcibly arrest them, or make their lives extremely difficult, which is one way of handling this, more of them are going to be out there. And, go on, if you can't do something with those people who are distressing beforehand, before they do some really bad thing, not say just urinating by Rupert Murdoch's house, which caused a whole number of stories in the Post. Some of them are going to do terrible things. Someone you divert from a drug program, someone you divert from a jail sentence into a drug program who doesn't bother showing up, who has a long record, who in hindsight was clearly just a thug and a villain, exactly the sort of person. De Blasio said so today, Bratton said so today. How could this happen? The judge who did this, McLaughlin, is a serious law and order judge. He's not a liberal hug-everyone person. When you start turning these knobs, you're going to create poster children. It happens on one side with Guillermo, with Diallo, with Dorisman, with Garner. It happens on the other side with some thug who's friends with other thugs, who's terrifying people who live in that community, who gets to, because he uses PCP, gets to not go to jail, who then shoots a cop. It's a bad and terrifying thing. It's not actually the basis to make policy on. When we get away from anecdotes, and we look at how dangerous policing is in America right now, when we look at city after city, the idea that there's some crisis after a long drop in crime, and that this push for reform is creating it. So on Heather's list, she said, because of this, we've had arson, assassinations, the elimination of grand jury procedures in New York, I'm missing one or two things, and a presidential policing panel. Those are strange things to mix. I'm not sure I totally agree on the grand jury panel, but that's sort of in the weeds for us as to whether or not that's been eliminated, because Schneiderman can now come in early in the process and oversee police-involved shooting investigations. But simply put, most of those things, arson, no. But we've now had 5 suspicious church burnings in Ferguson. And this actually makes me sympathetic to black people who are furious at how much coverage there was over one CBS burning. This was not Baltimore up in flames. Baltimore has gone up in flames. Newark has gone up in flames. Harlem has gone up in flames. So keeping angry people doing violent things that are bad and not a great method for getting change in proportion, nonetheless, I think is essential. Policing New York, with these 4 killings this year, you go back and look, or in the last year, at the 70s or 80s, really scary periods in New York, and you find those 10-month stretches. There's a lot of them. It gets a lot worse. If we're able to turn these knobs and we're looking at a 5% increase in shootings, most other crimes going down, and police are suddenly more accountable in the way the rest of society always has to have been, and this is where I want to close, right? The stop and frisk pressure started with Elliot Spitzer back when he was Attorney General. He started tracking those numbers, and eventually the NYCLU and other people caught onto them and created a whole shtick. And they ported it from place to place very dishonestly. So in a city like Newark, that's totally incomparable to New York, where almost all the policing is in cars, the numbers are wrong. In New York, they're wrong. Everywhere they're wrong, because crime rates are not evenly distributed. So you get away from that. You get away from some of the more absurd bans, that it's difficult for cops to be out on the streets if people are filming them and yelling stuff at them and all that. And you reach a moment where it's not actually terrifying, where police officers are not being assassinated left and right, where what's happening is ordinary political pressures are being brought to bear on them in ways they have not been. Statistics are being kept and more are being demanded instead of hiding behind states' rights, behind assertive magic, behind there's no way to compare numbers from place A to place B. And that political pressure is taking serious law and order actors like Bratton and forcing them to acknowledge a need for reform, to try to control it and mitigate it in such ways that like lots of terrible people are not roaming the streets, crime is not exploding up, and to seize on it. And to me, that is a very healthy thing, and basically how democracy is supposed to work. And people on one side of the issue want to say all policing is violence and sin, and people on the others want to say there's nothing to do but say thank you for policing. That, again, that's fine. That's how politics works. People put out absolutist positions, other people get sympathy with, or broadly absolute positions. Other people who are in natural sympathy cotton onto that, ignore all the countervailing evidence. In fact, there are costs and benefits to policing, and we're working to remeasure what they are with more evidence, with new sort of politically engaged and informed people in this mix. And we seem to be doing nationally, and particularly in New York, I think, a reasonably good job of that.
Thank you.
Obviously, there's always room for reform, but the New York Police Department has been at the forefront of reform for at least the last 20 years. And again, it is practically unthinkable how restrained it is, as Harry admitted. It's compared to the size of the city, the number of contacts that the department has, it is peerless in its self-restraint. I would take exception to Harry's, what I understood, I may have misunderstood, trying to contextualize or belittle the Baltimore violence. I would say that anybody who has lost his livelihood through arson and looting, that is a travesty, and that is an absolute failure of society to maintain law and order. The fact that the whole city didn't burn down is irrelevant to those people who did lose their livelihoods, and that's true for Ferguson as well. I would also say that it's not symmetrical. It is true that there have been horrible miscarriages of tactics over the years in the NYPD. The Amadou Diallo killing. Louima, absolutely. Eric Garner, that nobody deserves to die, quite obviously, for a quality of life offense like selling loose cigarettes. That was a miscarriage of tactics, but it also needs to be said that if Garner was not in the very poor health condition that he was in, that takedown would not have resulted in his death. But sadly, as hard as the New York Police Department tries to eliminate all miscarriages of force, that's almost impossible. Every profession makes mistakes. The scary thing about the police is when they make a mistake, it can have lethal effects. I would not see that as equal to crime, that there's anything remotely similar in either the moral valence of a good faith mistake, as most of them are, except, I mean, Louima was absolutely shameful. That was clearly criminal assault, if not attempted murder. But Diallo was not a bad faith effort to kill a man. That's not symmetrical to crime. The 10,000 lives, there's no sleight of hand there, it's very simple. And if you can do the math yourself. Homicides at their peak were 2,245. In 2013, they were down to 333. The vast majority of victims are black males. You simply generate each year how many lives have been saved if crime had remained at its early 1990 level of 2,245. come out with the proportion of black males and you get about 10,000, easily 10,000 lives have been saved. I think Harry was saying that he's not sure that policing is responsible for the bulk or the entirety or part of the crime drop in New York. I would disagree with that. Yes, crime went down nationally, but the crime drop in New York was twice as deep and lasted twice as long. Our felonies are down about 80%. The national crime drop is about 40%. New York has led if you took out the New York crime drop from the national crime drop, you would not have 40%. And the only thing that changed in New York over the 20 years was the style of policing. Liberal root causes for crime didn't change, and conservative root causes for crime didn't change. You know, since the 1965 Presidential Commission on Crime under Lyndon Johnson, that was the main articulation of a more liberal explanation of crime, which said really the only way you can lower crime is by eliminating poverty, income inequality, racism, and that we should have more social programs. That's been the dominant liberal conceit. The conservative root causes that I would advance, and I have advanced, is that family breakdown is the source of crime, that you cannot have a civilization where children are not being raised by fathers at the level that you see now in the inner city. Well, none of those root causes changed in New York. Poverty rates didn't go down, income inequality didn't go down, demographics didn't change radically, the youth population, nor did out-of-wedlock child rearing go down. It's still very high in New York, but crime dropped 80%. The only thing that changed was New York's style of policing. So I would be a strong advocate for that the policing did matter. And as for black people not being grateful for the crime drop, it depends on whom you talk to. It's true, there's lots of people who are angry. And some people, there are unquestionably a whole lot of innocent, law-abiding black men who have been stopped. And it is infuriating and humiliating and sometimes terrifying to be stopped and questioned by the police when you're innocent of any wrongdoing. That is a horrible toll. But that is a crime tax that innocent black men pay because of the crime rates. There is no question that innocent black men have a much higher chance of being stopped than white men. The police cannot do anything about that. When you have blacks committing between 75 and 80% of all shootings in New York, every time there's a police shooting and the cops are called out on a gun run, they are hoping against hope that they're going to get a suspect description that is white. And it almost never happens. The victims of and witnesses to shootings are the ones who are responsible for this data. They're the ones that tell us that blacks commit 75 to 80% of all shootings and whites less than 2%. So that means that when the cops are looking for a shooting suspect, they are almost never looking for a white man. The way you solve that is not to handcuff the police, it's to bring the black crime rate down. For the last 20 years, we have been talking obsessively about alleged police racism in order not to talk about a much more painful problem, and that is black crime.
Harry?
But many blacks are very thankful for the crime drop. It has liberated them.
Yes, many absolutely are. You know, I mean, the polling is pretty clear. And yes, you know, people I talk to and look at the numbers, many black people are absolutely appreciative and very broadly supportive of the police. The polling is clear that many more are not, most of whom are good, law-abiding citizens in the same neighborhoods. So, you know, I'm just inclined to trust if black people who are not committing crimes or unhappy with how they're being policed, I have to ask why. And suddenly we have a mayor who owes his election in no small part to, I'll leave out other political things here, but in no small part to his family and 2 black voters in New York, and who's responsive in different ways and has managed to pull that off without any serious increase as of now, and we'll see where things go in the crime rate. So if we had this, you know, if stops were a tax, nominally, and we're all just sort of accepting that these numbers correspond to underlying realities for conversation's sake, and in some ways they don't, right? But accepting those numbers, we've now had like a 95% drop in that tax for a very slight increase in shootings in almost every other crime category except murders, which is a big one down. And murder is still on track to be the 3rd lowest year in the city's history. So it seems like without that tax, we can do pretty well. The police have been able to shift and accommodate, and there's look, every cop I talk to thinks there's more guns in New York than there were a couple of years ago. I am utterly convinced they're right, and can point to a number of reasons for that. If we look at certain precincts, so I'll just do East, right? East Harlem, where this murder just happened, East Flatbush, which is the 70 and the 70 and the 67, right? East New York, which is the 75. Like, their numbers are up, and they're up more than the citywide take.
What numbers?
Shootings and murders. They're not terrifyingly up, but they're up. Minus this tool, which had clearly some effect. You know, the police are struggling to figure out within this new political reality what they can do to keep the numbers down. So far, they basically managed to do that. Now, a couple things I want to come back to there. Yeah, police violence is not symmetrical. It is, as Heather said, very often there are 2 sorts. Most of the incidents she mentioned were bad results, not bad will. I would wholly agree, right? There are other incidents that don't always make the press or dominate headlines that are in fact bad will. Many of them are not recorded. The force and 2% of stops numbers depends on the NYPD's own numbers. There's a bunch of other data that suggests that the actual force rate is higher from the cops I talk to and people in neighborhoods I talk to. I'm inclined to believe that. Again, I didn't admit that the NYPD is a good and disciplined force. I've written that many times. I think it could be better, and that's important because, yes, police violence is not symmetrical, right? When you get a badge and a gun, and you are actually the authorized agent of the society who can use force, who can remove people from the streets and their homes and all that, I think you have to be held to a very high and very serious and very scrupulous standard. And when people fall short of that, sometimes accidentally, I don't think Pantaleo, the officer who put his arms around Gardner's neck, is a murderer. I don't think anyone seriously thinks that. I think that was stupid and unnecessary, that there was a sergeant there with a taser. Fat Man was not going anywhere. And the need to bring him down that way was bad. And I think when you look at black communities in particular, and with their history with policing, some additional restraint and a high, serious standard the police are held to is basically a good thing. And I don't think it allows for massive return to crime past what we've had. I think police can be professional, can be held to these standards, and unions will worry about it. And you know, I talked to a ton of good cops, and cops that didn't like what Pantaleo did, and they all said, "Oh my God, there but for the grace of God go I." You know?
Pantaleo.
I said the officer who put his arms around Gardner's neck and brought him down in what may or may not have been a chokehold. Like good cops who were appalled by that whole setup and did not like him, and you had sort of a group of like roided up Staten Island cops who did not seem great, a whole number of ways. No one wanted to kill this guy. But if you do enough policing things, scary things happen. Sometimes there's a guy on a bike and he ends up shooting you. Sometimes you put your arms around someone's neck and something terrible happens. Or you fire a shot and there's a reflection in the vestibule behind you and everyone freaks out and keeps firing shots. And next thing you know, it dominates national headlines. That is not a question of bad will, but what we're seeing is police can be held to a sensible and higher standard, and it works. So to go to Baltimore, this is the last thing I want to say. Scott Stringer, after one of the recent bad murders in New York, said the most, I like Scott Stringer, he's the city controller. He wants to be mayor. He wants to appeal to white Democrats. He said the most obnoxious thing I've heard in a long time. He said, you know what, I don't care what the numbers say. If there's one murder in New York, you tell the grandmother the crime's going down. Forget about the numbers, right? That's insane. And it's obnoxious, it's true, but if you're a politician, if you're dealing with the city at large, you are dealing in numbers. And yes, you have to go, which Bratton and Blasio did today, to this cop's family and talk with them, Far Rockaway, right? You got to do all that stuff. But you're also like, in any policy, police are going to use force, some things are going to happen. We totally agree. And that means that scale and proportion matters. So when you look at Baltimore and you say a pharmacy burned down, kids were really rowdy. A handful of gang members were out, right? This is not a good thing, and the Baltimore police, unlike the New York police, when there were protests here, basically just quit doing their jobs. I mean, really quit. And the crime rates have shot up. And the police are, you see, without us, this is what happens. Which is outrageous. But I'm telling you that a pharmacy burning down is not the same as a city burning down. And treating one as the same as the other, oh God, we're back to the 1960s in that way. And the conversation is clearly back to the argument from the 60s in I think, very unhealthy ways. But treating the one as the same as the other, it's an absolute failure, you say. Anyone who lost their livelihood, it's an absolute failure. It is for that person, but that's not how you work out how policing works in a city or in the nation. That's not healthy. And conflating like arson of a pharmacy with a presidential task force, with assassinations, with Cuomo, tweaking how cop investigations work here. Two of those things seem to me reasonably healthy. Two of them are obviously bad, but I don't know quite how they stack together. It just seems we're having a police reform conversation that has not led to really terrifying things happening, and maybe is leading to some good reforms. And finally, if we start having some actual comparable numbers, and not bogus ones, like the stop and frisk numbers, which I have many, many issues with, and I think were really gained by reform advocates, but serious ones about police force, about deadly police force. We don't even have that tracked nationally. That's nuts. When I asked the FBI about that 6 months ago, and they're sort of scrambling now, they told me they were going to get back to me. They didn't, and finally, I got on background, like, we're really looking at what the Guardian and the Washington Post and Deadspin, the sports site, are doing. That's pathetic. So cops who don't really want to have this compared, because it's supposed to be magic, it's supposed to be all them. And when I talked about the decline, and not all that being policing, I was referring to the national drop. The drop in New York was exceptional. Policing clearly played a larger role there. Policing in New York is better than policing is nationally. It still should be better, but it's been very impressive, and I don't want to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater, but come on, there's work to be done.
Well, I agree that the police should be held to a higher standard, and they are held to a higher standard. But I think what frustrates some of us with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement is that if 1/10 of the attention had been paid over the last 20 years to black-on-black killings as is paid to bad shootings by cops, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But as long as crime is as high as it is, these insane, these just mindless drive-by shootings. I mean, in Cleveland, there's been 3 children under the age of 5 who have been killed in the last month. None of us know their names. Who knows the name of Marcus Johnson, who is a 6-year-old killed in a St. Louis park on March 11th of this year, the same day that protesters were again converging on the Ferguson Police Department, demanding the resignation of the entire department. This seems to be treated as a matter of course. The data that I've found shows that blacks surprisingly commit about a proportional number of mass shootings.
Really?
Mm-hmm. It just doesn't get in the news so much, but we had that recent TV shooting case. I mean, there are some, and before that there was another work site shooting. I guess you can flip it and say why. So, assuming arguendo that there's a relatively proportionate number of mass shootings of people that are just crazy, then the question is, why aren't there the standard drive-by corner shootings that afflict and continue to afflict the black community? And I would say there, it's a result of kids, too many kids being raised without fathers, as Kay knows more than anybody else here, that have not been given that self-control and self-discipline, so that the gun-toting becomes a matter of course, and shooting over the most insane reasons, like feeling like you're dissed or there's an argument over a girl, becomes a way to settle disputes.
Harry, you said
Very quickly, you're making me say a nice thing about Al Sharpton, which I'd rather not. But, you know, we get like 35 letters a week to the Daily News making this very point. And Sharpton, in fact, would say, and correctly, that he's been talking about this for 20 years and that the press doesn't care. Now, leaving Sharpton aside, because he's his own can of worms with Trump and these other people should have disappeared in the 80s. You know, if you go into any, you know, I was just with the Metro IF, and there is community group after community group after church, after you know, neighborhood person after neighborhood person who does nothing but try to deal with this, and it doesn't make a narrative the same way, and it has not plainly dealt with the problem with mostly young men being very violent. But the idea that that's because there's no talk about it or discussion within the black community or its leadership, I think is actually wrong.
National prison rates have stabilized, but in New York, the amazing thing, prison rates went way down, even as arrests went way up in New York, above all misdemeanor arrests, because of broken windows policing, that the police were arresting serious felonious behavior before it had a chance to ripen into it. So we've had like a 20% drop in the prison population while the rest of the country was still going up. But yes, the Fox Butterfield effect, I would say that the rising incarceration rates throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, I would argue, contributed to the crime drop. And we will see what happens now if we can continue that, if we go into a massive de-incarceration phase.
In Rikers, you went from like a daily population of 22,000+, where, you know, there's a lot of issues with Rikers right now, to a population of under 10,000. So that's a reasonable proxy for some smaller arrests, and, you know, people doing a year or less. So New York really is distinct from the national trend here, and the national trend is pretty clearly peaked. You know, it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the end of this administration and with what Gillibrand and Paul and others are pushing. And with this new police group, including Bratton, I brought up before, that's now law enforcement group, including Bratton and Vance, McCarthy, the LA guy, you know, they're all together and saying we want less of this. And we're going to see what that actually means and what effect it has on crime rates. Paul Moses wrote about this in New York for Newsday at the time. It's about 1999. Everyone acknowledges that the part of the decline of the murder rate was better ERs.
So why?
But these numbers are not so easy to fake here. We have all sorts of layers of outside monitorship and oversight, more so under this mayor. If you want to get back into this, right, there was just a big LA Times theory about whether or not the numbers in LA over the last 10 years were skewed. And I have no doubt there's some skewing at the edges. I think more of it happens at precincts, where people are discouraged from filing reports, or reports get pushed down. But the facts are that if you look at discharges, weapons discharges, of murders, and things that are just very hard to fake, you have a good baseline. You're not seeing other numbers move in crazy directions. You're not seeing tons of misdemeanors and like no ag assaults or stuff like that. But there are enough very smart people looking very closely at these numbers that the space to completely fake it, I think, is pretty limited.
De Blasio knows that his legacy depends on keeping crime down, and he was smart enough to hire Bratton in the first place. The amazing thing is now we have a benchmark that's been set, and we know that the NYPD can bring crime down. If it goes up, it's on his watch. So I think they are going to do whatever it takes to keep crime down, and that's why we've had this massively expensive Summer All Out program lasting pre-summer and post-summer. You know, I don't think he's going to roll back broken windows very much, but if crime continues to go up, they will do what needs to be done, and that will be increasing more stops. People are, Harry's right, there's a lot more guns out there. In the height of it, the shootings were way up.
Back in this January?
Yeah, that slowed down. For those weeks, if you go back and look at the crime stat reports, or the news coverage for that matter, shootings in high crime precincts were way up. So, and then the police did start going back to the jobs. But during that period, there was definitely a relationship. And this has been shown again and again. There was a very serious regression analysis that was done of Cincinnati. They had anti-cop riots in 2001 after the shooting of a black guy. And the police also engaged in depolicing, and crime shot through the roof.
Go to the NYCLU website. You can track all this data pretty easily. There's a form called the 250 that you fill out for each of these encounters, and they've collected, you know, this data, and they have their own spin on some of it, but it's I mean, the numbers are there and are pretty easily consulted.
You know roughly what
So-
they are?
Well, that just shows the percentage of stops. That doesn't do the calculation that you're talking about.
But
You'd
you
have
can-
to,
yeah.
well, it'd be pretty complicated. You'd have to, you know, it involves a bunch of arithmetic, but it's certainly doable. I mean, I can only tell you anecdotally, and I have talked to people who say, I've never been stopped because I'm a good boy or I hang out with the right people. I've also talked to people who say, yes, I've been stopped. And I've talked to people who said, I've been stopped and the police were doing their job, and I don't mind. And of course, there's people who've been stopped and are pissed off as hell about it, understandably. But the idea that was prevalent during the height of the stop, question, frisk wars, that every single young black man in New York has been stopped and questioned, only half of the stops ever resulted in frisk, is simply not true. It is easy enough to find people who have not been stopped. That doesn't make it any easier on those people who have been stopped. And the one thing I agree with, again, is the courtesy and respect training. The officers have to explain why they made that stop. Well, the bulk of stops, I mean, as the New York Civil Liberties Union never ends, it's the bulk of stops are blacks and Hispanics.
You can want more policing and less policing and not be happy with the policing you have. These are obviously not contradictory things. If you think there's crimes happening and that's bad, but the wrong people are being stopped, I think that's pretty easy. Stops are a really bad proxy for this conversation. We've had them because the NYPD is so parsimonious with its raw data, as every police department is. And you know, you go to the Office of Public Information there, the press office, they have typewriters and stuff. I mean, it's like you're stepping into many years ago. And consequently, this number they had to report, that was this one objective number, became this placeholder for everything else. And the issue isn't really getting stopped. Like, stops are actually not that big a deal, or such an atrocious intrusion. It's there's all this policing happening that we can't see, that's not being measured or isn't being accurately measured, and here is some number we can hold on to sort of point to everything else and point to these other concerns. As to where I really disagree, I'm very dubious that we're presently having a Ferguson effect, and I think that the defense of the NYPD can turn into a sort of police patriotism that blocks blocks sensible and effective reforms, and the Black Lives Matters movement, which is probably not ideal, and some of which I find absurd, and much of which I find compelling, seems to have managed to push this political conversation forward in some reasonably effective ways that in New York and nationally, I'd argue, have not done damage. And that seems to me like a basically healthy and basically political role. And the sort, you want people playing in a responsive society where voters are engaged in how they're policed.
are you arguing, I hope you're not arguing, that there's no Ferguson effect outside of New York? Because Baltimore is a very good example of the Ferguson effect. Crime is shot through the roof.
Baltimore is all messed up, and it's been messed up since Gray and since the police stopped working in large parts of the city there. But unquestionably, I'm strongly arguing that this is not the case nationally. The issues in St. Louis and Ferguson preceded this. Zimmering, who some of his work you brought up before, I know contested this. Various other people did. I'm having a hard time seeing
They've
it.
been totally disproven. I mean, have you seen the crime numbers? It's like 60 cities, they're way up.
There are a lot of cities, and I just look at the national numbers, and I've seen the cities you pointed to in particular, so like Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Baltimore, where I do see this. And it's hard for me, to
Los Angeles.
Well, not Los Angeles.
Yes,
Yeah.
Los Angeles, yes, Los Angeles.
All right, I'm afraid we've reached the end of the discussion, and if you want to try to grab these guys now, you can. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.